الآن يمكنكم المشاركة في مبادرة الأيام الرقمية تحت شعار انطلق بقوة مع جوجل، والتي يتناول فيها خبراء جوجل عناوين جديدة أسبوعيا مثل السحابيات، مهارات من جوجل، أندرويد، فلتر، ذكاء الآلة، فايربيس، ديزاين ثينكينج، مقسمة إلى دورات وورشات عمل يومية بالإضافة إلى مسابقات أسبوعية. شاهد الأيام الرقمية مباشرة على اليوتيوب وشارك رأيك وأسئلتك مع خبراء جوجل، واحصل على شهادة حضور في كل محاضرة تشترك فيها. هذا وأكثر من الأحد إلى الخميس ابتداء من الساعة 9 بتوقيت دبي عبر الرابط المبين youtube.com/gdgmena.
Hello everyone, my name is Samia Ashraf. I am a Flutter developer working for an IT startup here in Dubai. So I have over 2.5 years of experience in building Flutter applications, which are both mobile as well as web. And if you're listening to me for the first time, then I would like to share a little bit about myself with you. So who am I? I am also a Road to GDE graduate. So Road to GDE is a program that it's like a program to prepare yourself when you want to apply for the Google Developer Expert program. So it's a 3-month course that prepares you for that. And along with that, I am also a Women Tech Makers Ambassador. So both of these programs are from Google. They are by Google. And I'm also a co-organizer in the official Flutter meetup group in the UAE, which is Flutter Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So I'm one of the co-organizers in that group. So that was all about myself. And the topic that I have chosen for today is architect your Flutter app using Bloc state management. And the reason why I've selected this topic is this is an extremely important concept. The app architecture is extremely important working on when you're working on apps, like bigger apps and even smaller apps. And it took me some time to actually understand why app architecture is important. So today in this session, I will be sharing with you the importance of app architecture and also why Bloc is one of the state management techniques that I've used for today, that I've selected for today's topic, and also how app architecture can be used with Bloc and the different layers of the architecture, which is the UI, which I've separated into view layer, logic layer, and also the repository layer. And some of the common widgets, like the common widget concept is also an extremely important concept that I will be discussing today. And finally, I will also be talking about the project folder structure. So you can also have your own project folder structures. So I will be sharing mine with you, and you can also share your project folder structure in the chat box. So let us begin with the importance of app architecture. Now, the way I like to explain this is, I like to explain it with a scenario. Like for example, you have one full day with you, and you want to make this day productive. So what you're going to do is, in order to make the maximum, in order to make it maximum productive, I'm going to plan the things by writing them down at the beginning of the day. That today I want to do the laundry, today I want to go for a run, today I want to meet an electrician. So I'm going to note down everything before I actually start the day. And what happens is, um, as I go about, so I know that these are my tasks. So as when I finish the first task, I know what is my second task going to be, and so that's how I'm going to complete all the tasks. So I know that there are 5 things that I need to do for today, and this is how I'm going to divide my time. This is how I'm going to split my time. Now, as Now let's also, that can be considered as case one. Now let us consider case two, where the whole day I don't have anything planned, but I still want to make it productive. And I don't want to actually write down the things that I want to do for that day. So what I will do is, I'm going to, so at the beginning of the day, I know that, okay, this is something that I need to do. That is, do the laundry. Okay, I'll do the laundry. And when I finish it, I'm going to see what is the second task that can be done. And I'm going to also lose some time in thinking what are the tasks in line for that day. Now, I will also, now not that I will get all the 4 or 5 tasks done, but it's just that I have spent some time in thinking like what has to be done next. And I have also spent some time doing other things which weren't really relevant. And I did that because I wasn't aware that how much time I should split for each task. Now that can be considered as case two. Now, note that case one is going to be the most productive day because I haven't wasted my time thinking what needs to be done next because I had everything planned, and I had also the time split up, so which is also going to help me. The same way, when you're developing apps, this is extremely important. Noting down the things to do or structuring down the features is extremely important because it can save you lots of time, and it will also contribute in a well structured app. Now, let's say, for example, I have a login screen that I want to design. And the design, what I will do is, in order to have a well structured app, I'm going to separate the design from the logic of the app. So, in this way, what happens is the design is only going to have the design element of the login screen, and the logic element is going to have the entire functionality and everything of login screen, which we will be seeing in the next slides. But just to put it out there, that having an app architecture can promote a well structured app, and it also promotes collaborative work. Now when you select the case one, that is when you plan everything ahead of starting the project, the main thing, by writing it down, I mean that having a well architecture of the app. Now what happens is that if there are 4 people working on one project, if everybody is going to follow the same architecture, it makes the entire process of development easier. And if you don't have an app architecture, that is the way of writing the code, then what happens is that if there are 4 people, then one person is going to have their own architecture, their own way of writing code. Second person is going to have their own way of writing code. And the third person is going to be completely blank when they're going to read the first and second person's code. If not blank, they will definitely take long time to understand what is actually happening. And this is why there should be a very good architecture when you're developing apps. And it also makes adding a new feature or removing an existing one easier, because now you know that if you want to add something in the view, then you will just enter the logic part of the login page and add something there. And if you have everything in one screen, that's just going to make it difficult, because then you'll have to sit and look for the part where you want to add the feature. And it also improves the debugging process, because since everything is like structured, it becomes easier. Now, why block? So why have I selected block as a state management technique here? Now, by no means am I saying that block is the best state management technique out there. I feel that the only state management technique that you should be using is the one that you're most comfortable with, and the one that goes and works with your use case. So that is something that you should be using. And in today's session, I will be talking about block, how block can be used to architect an app. Now, Bloc simply stands for business logic component. So I think of Bloc as the the business logic or the brain of the application, the component that handles the logical part of an application. So let's say that in a login screen. So let's take the example of a login screen where I have two form fields. That is, one is for email and one is for password. And I have a button to submit, that is to call the login API. So the view part, that is all of the widgets, is going to come under the UI component or the presentation component, and calling of the APIs and updating the app and everything is handled by the logical part. So in that way, we can use Bloc as a state management technique. So the goal of using Bloc is to separate the presentation layer from the business logic, and this actually facilitates testability and as well as reusability, and this also promotes it takes comparatively lesser time because you have everything separated and you know what has to go where. So that is one of the things about Bloc. And the way Bloc works is, so for every event there is going to be one or multiple states. Now, what is event and states? So let's go back to the example of the login screen. Like I said, there are going to be two text form fields and one button, one text form field for email and one for password. So now event is like when I update the email, I'm going to call an event email changed event. And when I'm updating the password, I'm going to call the password changed event. And similarly, when I'm going to press on the sign in button, I'm going to call the sign in event. Now that event, so event in simple words is when you make a change, you're going to call an event. Now this change can have an impact. Like for example, the sign in. There are three possible things can happen when I click on the sign in button. My app first of all is going to run into a loading state. Secondly, after the API is called and the data is fetched, the API can return data. So it can be a successful login or it can be unsuccessful login as well if something went wrong when I called the API. So, like for example, if I did not have internet access, it's going to throw an error. So, login is going to fail. So, these three scenarios are going to be called as states. So for one event, that is the sign in with email and password, I can have three states, that is loading state, login successful, and login unsuccessful. And the best way to make Bloc work is to use it with the freezed classes. Now, freezed is a package and it's a code generator basically. And what it does is it writes code for you, or in other words, it generates code for you. And it works brilliantly with blocks, is going to simplify the entire development process. So let's dive deeper into the events and the states. So I'm going to stick to the login example because that's most simpler to understand. Now, like I said, there can be three events: email changed, password changed, and sign in with email and password. So these are the three events that can possibly occur. And the states, so when I say email changed event, the state that's going to be emitted is updated email value. And for password, when the event is called, the state will be it's just going to store the updated value of the password. And the next three states, which is login success, failure, and loading, these are the states for the sign in button. That is when the API is being called. Now notice the figure that I have here. So it's like a two-way functionality. From UI, it's calling Bloc, and from Bloc, it's calling the UI. And that is how you should be architecting the app if you're using Bloc. The way this works is, like, for example, when I press the email, when I press the sign in with email and password, now the button exists in the UI. From the design part, I won't be calling the API directly. That is wrong. So that is possible, but it's not a best practice, I would say. The way you should be doing is, from the UI, you should be actually calling the event, and the event is comes to the Bloc part. Now what the Bloc does is, when it receives this event, it's going to make a call to the API. So Bloc is the one that's going to handle the API calls. Your UI will have nothing to do with the APIs. It just sits there and makes event calls. So Bloc makes a call to the API, and once the API returns successful data, the Bloc is again going to send the data back to the UI. So this is how you can create a two-way between the UI and the Bloc. So next, let's look at the app architecture using the Bloc. Now, I have separated view, logic, and data provider. So in my view, I only have UI widgets. There are only widgets in my UI. And the Bloc here consists of events, states, and repository. So the event and the states are actually part of the Bloc, and all of my app logic is going to be inside the Bloc. Now, don't think of it as the entire app logic. So it's actually, every feature is going to have a dedicated Bloc. Like, for example, login is going to have its own Bloc, and it's going to have its own events and states. Now, sign up will have its own sign up Bloc. So this, in that way, we can separate the blocks so that we don't have all the states and all the events in one Bloc. So that should be avoided. And model here is, models are actually definition of objects that is used that can be used to store the API data. So, like, for example, after I make the call to the API, I'm going to get some data. So let's say, like, okay, so not the login screen. So let's say that I'm going to call get account information of so and so user, and it's going to return to me some data, like the name of the person, the ID of the person, so and so. So all of these things, I need to store it somewhere before I actually populate it into the UI. So the way I will be storing it is in an object, and that will be handled by the models. So I can have something called as an account model, or user model, weather model. So models are basically used to store data that comes from the API so that it's easier to pass them into the UI. And repository contains calls to API. So repository is a totally different folder that's going to contain methods that make calls to API. I can have a dedicated folder that contains all of the authentication API calls. So inside the authentication repository, I can have login method that calls the API, that makes call to login API. I can have a sign up method that makes call to sign up API, so and so. For forgot password, reset password. So you can separate it like feature by feature. And also notice the arrows here. The UI is going to make call to the Bloc event. Bloc event is going to make call to the repository where the API is. The repository is then going to call the API service. API service is going to return some data, which is going to go back to repository. Now, this data has to be converted into an object, which will be done in the models. From the models, it's going to come back to repository, and from repository to the block, it will be emitted as a state, and from the block, it's going to go to the UI. So note that UI has no connection with the repository or the API service. The only connection that UI has is with the block. And because of that, you can actually make your UI stateless. And in the worst case, if you want to update something, then you can use something called as hook widgets. Hook widget is an extension of stateless widget. And if you want to learn more about hook widgets, in my Medium, I do have a Medium article written about it where I explain how hook widgets can be replaced for stateful widgets. And having stateless and hook widgets will ensure that less work is done by the UI. So yeah, this is the view layer. Next, we have the block widgets. Now, the entire block, there are going to be 4 widgets. So when you make a call to the API, when you make an event call, it's going to call API, and the API is going to it's going to return the data, which will be then emitted as a state in the UI. Now, how will the UI know that the block has emitted a state? So let us consider the example of login here. Now I have made a call to sign in with email and password event, and sign in with email and password is going to emit the states. Now what happens is, if you want a particular widget to use the login block, then you have to wrap the entire widget with block provider. And so block provider is a widget that provides block to all of its children. And once the state is emitted, so let's say that you want to rebuild, or you want to build the UI with the state, with the data that was returned during the state, then you can wrap that portion of the UI with the block builder. So block builder is used to build the UI as per the block state. And the best way to understand the block provider and block builder is, let's say you have a widget that contains text form fields, and these text form fields, when you enter the widget, will be initially empty. There is going to be no value inside them. The only value is the only value They will be filled with values that is going to come from the API. So the way you can use block provider and block builder is, the entire widget has to be wrapped with block provider, so that when you enter that widget, the block provider is when you enter that widget, it's the you're going to make call to the block event to get all the data. And since all of the text form fields has to be populated with the API data, the entire thing has to be wrapped with block builder, because then the text form fields will be updated with the block state, with the data that will be returned when the event was called. So that's how block provider and block builder works. And for block consumer, it's actually used to invoke a functionality in response to a state change. So let's say that in the login, when I click on the sign in button, after the API returns successful data, I want to redirect the user. So how will my UI know that the API was returned success? The API was successful. So how will I know that? Now, the way I can know that is, if I if I wrap the widget with block consumer, I'm going to listen to the state changes. So if login was successful, then inside the login success state, I'm going to redirect the user from the login page to the home page. So that is how you can use block consumer. So for one particular state change, if you want to if you want to apply a functionality, that's how you should be using block consumer. So here the functionality is nothing but navigation. And block selector filter updates by selecting a new value based on the current block state. So it's mostly the first three that you'll be using quite often in the when you're using the block state management. So next we have, so I've been talking a lot about email. I've been talking a lot about events and states. So now let's look at what exactly is an event and how does it look like? How can I call it from the UI? So this here, email changed, is actually the event that I was referring to previously. Whenever I update the email, I'm going to call the email changed event. And when I call the email changed event, the state that it's possibly going to take up is updated value of email. It's just going to store the updated email value. So that is one thing that we will be doing in the block. And so, and the way you'll be using the map event to state method to map the event with every state. So for one event, so and so state, so everything will be coming under the map event to state method. And previously I said that block is the business logic or the whole brain of the application. And the reason why I said that is because, like I said, UI can be a stateless or a hook widget because it's not doing any work. It's only making calls to the block events. So when you're entering the email, you will have a requirement to check if the email is valid or not, right? So all of that will be going under will come under the block. So all types of rejects checking and all of that will come under the block. So all of the logic part has to be inside the block. And yeah, so that's about block. And the other thing that I have here is an either return type. Now either return type is an extremely simple return type. So either it comes from a package called .c. So it's a package that you can find in pub.dev. So either is a return type that accepts two objects. And the reason it accepts two object is that it's mostly I mostly use it when I make calls to API. So let's say when I make a call to sign API, two things can happen. Either my API can fail because of some network issue or something went wrong and my API failed. Or the other thing is that the API was successful and it returned data. Now, for these two things, I can simplify things by returning both of them. So, either is a data type where you can have two objects, two return type objects. So, in my sign in scenario, I can have an auth failure object, which I will write on the left side of the angular brackets. So auth failure is the object that was returned when API was unsuccessful, and string or anything that you want, that you prefer. String is the return type that I will place on the right hand side, and that will be returned when the login API was successful. So let us look at so yeah, that was all about the either. So it's a very simple return type. You can explore more on this, and I would totally recommend you to use it because it can really solve a lot of things. So yeah, and it's very easy to understand also. So next we will be looking at event, and also, so this event here, now I want to make a call to get the account information of a particular user. So the only event that I have here is get account info started. And note that I'm using it with the freezed class. So it's a freezed with the freezed package. So like I said earlier, do not try to add all of the events into one block. Have dedicated blocks for every feature. So in this way, you can control things, and even for something like get account info, have its own dedicated block, like how I have here an event that makes call to the get account info started API method. Now for this event, when I make the call get account info started, there can be four possible states. It can be an initial state. So initial is actually a mandatory state for every block. And this is the first state when the widget is initialized. This is the first state when the widget will be initialized. And second thing that can happen is when I click on the button that makes call to the block event, I will be entering into the loading state, because essentially what's happening is the control goes to the API call and call to API will be made. So the widget will be busy and it will be entered into the loading state. And once the data is returned back, it can either be a successful state or a failure state. And if it is successful, I will be having an account object that will contain all of the data that I wanted. And there can also, and if things went wrong, the widget is going to enter load failure state, and I will be returned with an API failure object. So this is how a simple block to event will work. Next, I have the model. So the model is everybody will have their own definition for this, and which is completely fine. Again, models can also be used along with the freezed. So that is also one practice that you can follow. And this is essentially used to store data that is returned from the API, so that passing it to UI becomes simpler. And from the repository, when it makes calls to the API and when the data is returned, repository is going to send this data to model, and model is going to return an object. Like here it's a weather model object, and this weather model object is going to go back to the block, and it will be sent to the UI in the form of a state, like how we had here load success. So if you see this account is the model that was actually generated in the model class, and that is the one that will be used in the UI. Next, we have the repository. Now, repository is a collection of methods, different methods that make calls to API. And earlier I said that you can have dedicated repository folders. So for authentication, I can have an authentication underscore repository, which is going to have a collection or methods that make calls to authentication APIs, like sign in API. So in this case, I have a sign in with email and password. There can be a similar one for sign up with email and password, or for forgot password, reset password, logout. So you can have different API calls here. And here, notice that I'm again using the either return type here, and it's a type, it's a future type because I will be making call to the API. And so your login definition goes here, and since I'm making a call to an API, so I will wrap the whole thing with try and catch because anything can go wrong during the call. And if the API returns successful data, then I'm going to pass a string. And this string, since it's this string, I'm going to wrap it with write keyword. So write means I'm passing the write return type, which is a string. And if anything went wrong, I'm going to pass left return type, which is the auth failure. And if you notice, I'm actually passing an auth failure object here, that is server error. So that means left side of the either return type is passed, which is auth failure. And if you try to just jumble this up, if you say left and then string, it's going to throw an error because left return type, it's not string, it's actually auth failure. So yeah, it's a so repository here is a library of custom defined functions that make calls to API, and each function is going to have a different API call, and every function here will be called from the block, and it is also returned to the block. So there is no direct contact between the UI and the repository. This that can actually minimize errors. And also, and one thing that I have personally noticed, that when I called repository from the UI, it can make your app messy, and if it's a bigger application, you will spend a lot of time trying to figure out um, where did the things go wrong. So Bloc here manages everything for you, and since you have a dedicated block for every feature, it makes debugging a lot simpler as well. And functions, always a good practice to have either as a return type for functions, and use DIO or HTTP request methods to make API calls. And lastly, I want to talk about common widgets. Now, common widgets is something that has reduced the development time for me. It's just helped me a lot. So, common widgets are basically widgets that appear in multiple places in your project. So, like for example, uh, a button. So, a button of a particular design, it can be generalized into a widget. And common widgets can be basically buttons or even a row widget. If a row widget is appearing in your project multiple times, then you can just generalize into a common widget and then just call that widget in the places. And so this is what a common widget it looks like. So um, there is no rule or anything. It's just this one's basically designed by me. You can design your own common button. So I noticed that two buttons which were of the same decoration and everything appeared in multiple places. So here in this column it appeared in two places. So instead of having to write the um, entire widget twice, what I did was I made the elevated button into a common widget. So I called it as common button. And this here is actually a dynamic widget because everything is going to remain the same. The only thing that changes is the text that appears on top of the button and the on press property. Because if you're having the same button in two different places, they won't be doing the same job. They might have different text on them, and they might be redirecting to a different page. So that's why for this particular button, the text is going to be purple accent. Now for the second button, it can be something else. And the on press property as well, it can change. So here you can have a different on press property, and here also you can have a different on press property. Essentially what happens is when you call common button, this on press property will be called when this button is pressed. And for this button, it's going to be a different on press property. So in this way, this is just for buttons, but even for certain features, um, you can extract them and make it like a common widget. And it's extremely helpful if your entire project uses buttons with a certain type of decoration. And this is what my this is the folder structure that I follow. So the logic here is the views. The logic here is the blocks model and repository, and the views here is the part that contains the UI. So again, I divide it into separate folders. So the auth is going to have sign in and sign up UI, and then I have the dashboard UI, home, settings. So everything is separated into folders. And when it comes to the logic, the blocks is going to be one folder. Inside blocks, you can have login block, and you can have sign up block, reset password block. Models, again, it's the same thing. And repository, also, you can have authentication repository, and you can have home repository. So this is how you can um, structure them. And also note that it's completely separate folders, the logic and the views. So this way I can ensure that the code doesn't get mixed up between the view and the logic. And the takeaways. So the things that we learned today is the importance of having a well architected app, how it is going to help, and the role of the UI in the app architecture, and also the limitations of the UI, and having feature dedicated block, its events and the states. And we also saw some dynamic widgets, also called common widgets. And so, yeah, that was all for this session. Thank you. So if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat box. So can you also share these slides? Yes, I will do that. I'll try to share these slides. So you can follow me either on Twitter or on LinkedIn, where I will try to post these slides on both the platforms. No problem. Any more questions? Thank you, Selma, for joining and listening to the till the very end. So Selma asks, should Bloc be used with any scope project? So you can make Bloc work with any scope, I would say. So most of my projects are with Bloc. So the thing about Bloc is you can make it work for you. So that's one good thing about Bloc. And yeah, I think it works excellently with every scope. So the Bloc folder. Okay, so Sharif asks if I can show the Bloc folder. So I don't really have the Bloc elaborated here. But Bloc is it's usually a VS Code function that I use that creates the block when that actually creates the block. So you don't have to write the block code from scratch. So VS Code has an option how and you can select that option and it creates the files for you. That is the block file, the event file, and the state file. So you just have to write in your events like how I have written here. Yeah, this is like you're going to have the event class created and you just have to write in your event, and the same goes for the state. The boilerplate is going to be there and you just have to write in the states, the possible states that needs to be emitted. So I hope that answered your question. All right, thank you everybody for tuning in, and I hope you have learned something from this session. Thank you, no problem.